It's my nerd world, and welcome to it, a Depeche Mode podcast. This week in the world we live in, and life in general, is a new Depeche Mode album coming in 2023. I don't have specific news to share, but that seems to be the general consensus. Plus, from Louder Sound, one Stephen Hill, the author of this article, has ranked every Depeche Mode album from worst to best. It's an interesting read, and I wanted to share with you this fan's thoughts. As always, you can email me, TalkShowNerd@gmail.com.
My Nerd World.
It is My Nerd World, a Depeche Mode podcast, and I am your host, Jon Justice. Glad you were with another episode as we talk about all things Depeche Mode. TalkShowNerd@gmail.com, that is the email address. If you want to find out more about My Nerd World, you can head on over to mynerdworld.net. So, found an interesting article that at first I was sort of even hesitant to read, because, as I've mentioned so often on the show, art is subjective, and that is always true when it comes to Depeche Mode and those that love this amazing band. However, I came across this particular article, I read it, and was like, you know what? This is actually a pretty decent read, so I figured I would share it with you. Plus, we have some listener feedback we need to get into this week as well. Let's start off here, though, and I think it's the burning question for all of us Depeche Mode fans, and that is, when are we getting a new album? Now, I don't have a definitive answer for you. I know that we've had anecdotal stories from fans that have either come across Dave or Fletch or Martin. More specifically, it seems to be Martin. It seems as if the fans have had the opportunity to speak with him the most. And the latest that I've read of a fan that's actually had a run-in with Martin Gore is that he had said that they are planning a new album and they're just waiting to get Dave on board. This has sparked quite a bit of commentary on the home message board, which is where Depeche-mode.com, which is where I go most often to find out what's happening and what the fandom is talking about. And there seems to be quite a bit of discussion and also agreement and expectation that we will get a new Depeche Mode album sometime in probably late 2023. The band certainly is not on the same release schedule as they had been for decades now. I think the pandemic took care of that. Dave's work with Soul Savers certainly has changed up the way the band gets together. The band is getting older, as we've talked about on previous shows. However, it does seem as if there is at least another album in our favorite band, and it appears that it could be coming sometime next year, depending on whether or not the band has already gotten together and is heading into the studio, or maybe even in the studio and we're not aware of it at this point in time. And as always, ahead of a potential start of production for a new Depeche Mode album, a lot of conversation swirling around who is going to produce the next release, which is crucial when it comes to the sound of Depeche Mode, and it always has been. I know that not everybody was thrilled, and I wasn't all that thrilled with the final product in spirit. The album hasn't aged with me as well as I thought it would. As a matter of fact, I was on Facebook recently, and not too, it was a couple months ago, when it was the anniversary of the release of Spirit, and I remember reading my comment on Facebook saying that this was my favorite album since Violator. And I think on a first listen, it felt that way, but now that we've had some distance on it and I went back and revisited it, I don't share those same sentiments anymore. I like how it sounded sort of sonically. I wasn't bothered with the vocal effects that were used for Dave on the album. As a matter of fact, this morning I was actually listening to Some Great Reward, and it reminded me quite a bit of the sound of Martin's voice on It Doesn't Matter, which is one of my favorite songs from that era, and probably in the top 10 of all my favorite Depeche Mode songs. But the conversation has turned to the possibility of Alan Wilder returning to the band. And I would love to see that simply because of, Alan's involvement in some of what I believe are the best releases from Depeche Mode. That doesn't mean that we will get something similar to what we got back when Alan was in the band. However, his thematic elements and the way he sort of raises and elevates Depeche Mode's music, a lot of people point to his remix of In Chains from Sounds of the Universe as being a good example. I don't believe there's been any tangible evidence of a possibility of Alan's return, but it always ends up being the topic of conversation when we're talking about a potential new release for the band. So at this point in time, the expectation from a lot of individuals is that we could get an album sometime next year. If we don't get an album next year, I put a big question mark on, really what the future of Depeche Mode looks like after that, having so much distance between albums. And again, with the band members getting older, Dave's side projects, Martin's, side projects, it all remains to be seen. But if and when we do get some news, I'll certainly be sharing it here on my Nerd World, the Depeche Mode podcast. All right, let's get into the main topic this week, and this really interesting piece from Stephen Hill and Louder Sound. Every Depeche Mode album ranked from worst to best. Everyone loves Depeche Mode, don't they, right, Stephen? The Basildon to Essex synth pop chart. Botherers turned Dark Side Industrials turned stadium-filling Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductees have hoovered up members of every imaginable musical tribe as fans over their 4 and a bit decades as a band. Boy, there's a lot of wording in there that I'm not familiar with, and I'm probably botching a lot of it. They've also amassed a back catalog that is as varied as that of pretty much any artist you can mention. 14 full-length studio albums without ever really dropping the ball. And that's what I really liked about this particular piece. I don't generally like ranking anything. I'm a huge Star Wars fan. And for me, again, it's all subjective. My view of Star Wars films and which ones I like more than others, it changes quite a lot depending on my mood and what I'm watching and other content, and the same thing rings true for Depeche Mode. However, I like the honesty coming from Steven here of, the 14 full-length studio albums without ever really dropping the ball. He takes a very positive spin in his ranking. Your personal favorite, he goes on to write, may depend on whether you're a brooding, leather-clad goth, a decadent new romantic, or a hedonistic club kid, or something else entirely. Let's dive in. And again, it's all subjective. I do find this particular list, though, rather compelling in the comments that he had to share. Coming in at number 14 on this list of Depeche Mode albums ranked worst to best, they write, A Broken Frame, 1982. When you've just had a massive worldwide smash album, a worldwide smash on your first album, but the bloke who writes all your music decides to leave the band, you're in something of a pickle. So it's hardly surprising that Depeche Mode needed an album to get used to the situation in the band after Vince Clarke departed to do his own thing and was replaced by Alan Wilder shortly after the debut of Speak and Spell. A Broken Frame is the sound of a band who desperately want to move on from their first album, but with this being Martin Gore's opening crack at songwriting duties, aren't quite sure exactly how to do that yet. Monument is great, though. It's an interesting assessment, and I don't disagree with much of what he had to say. Coming in at number 13, Delta Machine from 2013. There's nothing strictly wrong with Delta Machine, and it does have a few fine moments over its overlong, he writes, 58-minute runtime. Singles Soothe My Soul, a great cyber disco romp, and vocalist Dave Gahan's suaveness on the swaying Bond theme-esque Heaven are great. But there really isn't much here that the band hadn't already done to a higher standard, he writes. If there aren't any obvious problems here, the lukewarm critical reaction to the record was largely based on a gnawing sense that this was the sound of a band treading water. Not bad, but far from essential. And again, while I may not put Delta Machine in this particular ranking, I don't disagree with the comments on his take of the album. I actually, as a side note, apart from music, and something I've talked about a lot because I feel like it's very much a part of what makes Depeche Mode great, beyond the songs, obviously, but the entire package around the band, including the artwork, liner notes, the photographs from Anton Corbijn. In Delta Machine, if we were ranking, and maybe we'll do that on another podcast at some point in time, the visual, artistic nature of Depeche Mode, I would rank Delta Machine quite high. I like the artwork on that album quite a bit, and Anton Corbijn's work. Coming in at number 12, Construction Time Again, 1983. It's probably worth at least investigating Construction Time Again for a variety of reasons, he writes. The most pressing one being that it's really the first time in their career that Depeche Mode sound, well, weird. Pipeline is an example, is nearly 6 minutes long and is deeply awkward. Industrial noise dirge that would have sent the band's early fans running a mile. They do it infinitely better later in their career, but it's good to hear the band really stretching themselves here. Obviously, the inclusion of the classic Everything Counts is one of the other reasons to give this album a spin, the obvious highlight, and a song that remains as iconic today as it did back in 1983. Coming in at number 11, according to Stephen Hill, is Exciter, 2001. Exciter is a bit of an oddity in the Depeche Mode canon. Having navigated the notoriously choppy waters of the 1990s by embracing alternative rock, the band took another risk by going for an even more modern ambient post-Kid A from Radiohead feel as the new millennium arrived. You'd think that with their history, this would be a bit of a tap-in for the band, but weirdly, they don't always sound entirely comfortable here. Exciter is one of the few Depeche Mode albums that sounds significantly dated. I don't necessarily agree with that, by the way. I actually gave that a spin recently, and again, it's subjective, but I didn't feel it sounded all that dated at all. However, he writes, check Gore's eyebrow-raising lyrics on The Dead of Night for proof. The opener, Dream On, has a Westworld-style cyber cowboy feel, which is excellent, but too much of the album falls short of this standard. My biggest complaint, if I was going to have one on Exciter, is sort of the lack of a good chorus on a lot of the tracks. And that was chronicled quite a bit in the making of on that record, and especially with the remastered documentary that was put out several years ago, in that album was very much a struggle for Martin Gore to write, and Dave Gahan hadn't come into the band yet writing his own songs. Coming in at number 10, Spirit, 2017. Depeche Mode had never been an overtly political band, but their songs have often been used as anthems for the downtrodden or disaffected. Even so, it was a slightly odd choice to see the band take such an outwardly political stance on Spirit. It partially seemed to be a reaction to praise from the figurehead Richard Spencer, who Gahan immediately branded as a C-word, I'm not saying it on this show, upon hearing Spencer describe DM as the official band of the alt-right, depending on what your definition of alt-right is. But I understand what they're saying, and Richard Spencer is a socket wrench, and for those who don't know what a socket wrench is, it's a tool, and Richard Spencer is a tool. Although the sentiment is great, it didn't result in a landmark album. I don't disagree there. The lead single, Where's the Revolution, is a Nine Inch Nails-esque the lead single, Where's the Revolution, the Nine Inch Nails-esque You Move, and the smooth Poison Heart are all great, but songs like Scum and Going Backwards are a little too on the nose for this to be a classic. And again, this being subjective, I very much consider Going Backwards to be a classic. I adore that song. Not a big fan of Scum, but I also agree that Where's the Revolution and Poison Heart specifically are all great. And Poison Heart is probably one of my favorite Depeche Mode songs of their past 3 or 4 albums. Coming in at number 9, Speak and Spell, 1981. There's an alternate universe where Vince Clarke decided to remain in Depeche Mode, and a site such as ours has no interest in covering their output. After all, as good as they are in their chosen field, we won't be appraising Erasure's back catalog in such a way as this. Speak and Spell is actually a very good record. It features an all-time classic 80s pop banger and just can't get enough. The long-forgotten likes of No Disco and New Life are great synth-driven foot tappers, and we're sure that had Clark had stayed with DM, we would have been. I'm sorry, I'm getting my words jumbled here, and I apologize. I do this show like I do my radio show, as if it were live. I don't edit, so you get all my goofs and everything else. So I hope you don't mind. And we're sure, he writes, that Clark, if he would have stayed, then DM would have been an excellent and very successful pop band. But surely no one can argue what we got instead was massively superior. All right, coming in at number 8, Sounds of the Universe, 2009. After nearly 2 decades fleshing out their sound with live instrumentation, Depeche Mode decided to go slightly more retro on their 12th album and use the classic synths of the early days as a base for Sounds of the Universe. It's a decision that bears early fruit, with the album opener In Chains sounding delightfully sci-fi and the opening of Wrong bobbing along in a wonderfully robotic manner. They don't completely bin off the guitars either, with fragile tension driven by a scuzzy riff. The band's longest studio album, Sounds of the Universe, runs out of steam. Hence its position here. But for longtime fans, this is a glorious little love letter to their early days. Coming in at number 7 on this list, Some Great Reward, 1984. For most bands, an album featuring 3 massive iconic songs, in this case, Master and Servant, Blasphemous Rumors, and People Are People, would almost certainly top a list such as this. But while Some Great Reward definitely represented a new creative high for Depeche Mode upon its release in 1984, the band have gone on to far outstrip it. Still, with the 3 songs mentioned above, the piano ballad Somebody, which replaces the clanging samples that enraged critics so much with something far more traditional, and the popping bass pulse of Lied to Me, all present here, this is undeniably a record we'd highly recommend. Coming in at number 6, Ultra, 1997. Alan Wilder departed Depeche Mode in 1995, with communication at an all-time low between the band members and Dave Gahan's addiction problems threatening to derail the band. It came to the point where Martin Gore considered splitting them up and releasing the material that would become Ultra as a solo album. It is quite amazing, then, that this record sounds as sublime as it does. The opener of Barrel of a Gun wonderfully sets the tone for what is to come, with Gahan candidly detailing his personal problems for all to hear, and for the most part, Ultra acts as a fantastic accompaniment piece to 1993's Songs of Faith and Devotion. It's the broken, regret-filled come down to the decadent primal howl from a few years before. All right, and here's our top 5. At number 5, Playing the Angel, 2005. The best DM album of the new millennium, Playing the Angel really does sound like a stadium band in their prime at the height of their powers and delivering exactly what their audience wants. In essence, it mashes up all of the very finest elements of Depeche Mode from each of the 10 albums that had preceded it, whilst also sounding remarkably contemporary by 2005 standards. The gorgeous Precious became the biggest hit the band had scored in well over a decade, and though that song dominates the track listing, the Scarbarous and acerbic industrial grind of the opener, A Pain That I'm Used To, and the propulsive synth pop of Suffer Well showed that DM were far from a nostalgic act. Coming in at number 4, Songs of Faith and Devotion, 1993. When the alternative rock boom of the early 90s happened, it ended the careers of many of the 80s biggest stars. But Depeche Mode, as a group, thrived, although as a slightly different story when it comes to the individual band members. Songs of Faith and Devotion saw DM put down the synths, pick up the guitars, and happily borrow from alt-rock, in the process delivering the band's heaviest, most organic-sounding album. It begins with a chunky, sleazy rock and roll riff of I Feel You, a song that finds Gahan at his most decadent, sordid, and seductive. But this was a group of men in bad places during the recording sessions. So there's a lot of darkness, a lot of drug references, and a lot of unpleasant scenarios explored here. It's not easy, but it makes for a fascinating and often moving listen. A few months after the record's release, Gahan suffered a minor drug-related heart attack and a failed suicide attempt, bringing the reality of this album into even starker context. As a snapshot of those issues, this is immensely powerful. Coming in at number 3, Black Celebration, 1986. It's no exaggeration to say that this may be the most influential Depeche Mode album ever released. Black Celebration is the point where the band stopped beating around the bush and dived headfirst into the squalid depths of darkness that so fascinated them. Death is everywhere. There are flies on the windscreen for a start, reminding us we could be torn apart. Croons gone on Flies on the Windscreen, leaving you in no doubt that the band that gave you Just Can't Get Enough are all but dead. Bleak, harsh, and unsettling, Black Celebration gave us the blueprint that Nine Inch Nails, Rammstein, and others would gorge themselves on for years to come. It's also got Stripped, one of their greatest songs ever. At number 2, Violator, 1990. The big blockbuster album of Depeche Mode's career. Maybe their finest in the eyes of many, but it takes the silver medal here. There's no doubt that Violator is a fantastic record, featuring, as it does, some of the band's biggest songs in Policy of Truth, Personal Jesus, and the definitive song of their career, Enjoy the Silence. The star power is balanced by the kind of slinky, dirty electro throbbers, such as Clean and Waiting for the Night, with which DM made their name. Violator sounds bigger and more obviously designed for stadiums than the band had at any point in their career. It's a solid boatload cemented. Let me back up. It sold a lot. Curse words here I don't want to put on the show. Cemented their place as a group as big as any on the planet and still sounds incredible today, a classic. It's really interesting after all these years, right? Since the release of that album, I'm listening to Violator about a month ago, and Sweet as Perfection comes on. And that's not a song that really grabbed me off of Violator. Okay, it's probably, if you asked me just, hey, least favorite song on Violator, I probably would have said Sweet as Perfection. However, for some reason, as I've got my headphones in, I'm walking into the radio station that I work at, it's playing into my ears, that song grabbed me in a way that it never, ever had, and now I absolutely love it. And it's, for me, it's a tribute to this band that you still can discover something years and years, decades later, of a song that I've heard hundreds of times that never really grabbed me, and suddenly, out of the blue, when the beats kick in at the second half of that track, it was just like, oh my gosh, how have I underappreciated this song for so many years? And coming in at number 1, Music for the Masses, 1987. The popular opinion is that either of the two albums that bookended Music for the Masses could be considered the artistic high point or the definitive statement of Depeche Mode's career. There are compelling arguments for Black Celebration and Violator and the styles they represent, but they overlook one crucial thing, writes Stephen Hill. Music for the Masses does what both of them do, and for the most part, better than either of them, he writes. You want the dark, brooding, unsettling material from Black Celebration? Little 15 and To Have and To Hold are just as sinister and depraved sounding. You desire the vast arena rock thrills of Violator? Never Let Me Down Again, the band's ultimate anthem, is on there. You crave the subtle atmospheric chill that they've always excelled at? The Martin Gore-fronted I Want You Now and Things You Said are as delicate as they had ever been. Hell, if you're one of those people who just wish they'd write more massive pop bangers than Strangelove and Behind the Wheel are for you. Even the closing track, the nightmarish, spiraling piano instrumental of Pimpf, is deliriously brilliant. Depeche Mode would go off in other directions. They'd evolve and metamorphose into plenty of other brilliant iterations, but they'd never straddle everything that made them so essential in the way they do here. That was probably, and it was, I only read a few of them before I started the podcast this week, but I would argue that that was probably one of the best rankings of anything in pop culture that I'd ever read. Not just because it was about our favorite band, but because it took a positive spin on it and didn't go the route of trashing it. It respected the source material, put it in an order that they deemed, right, in their own mind, being subjective, but handled it in such a way that it didn't frustrate you if you didn't agree with their opinion. And, honestly, I'm going to attribute that to just Depeche Mode fandom in and of itself. As a Star Wars fan, as I mentioned, or a fan just of, other things in pop culture, the one thing that's always stuck out for me among Depeche Mode fans is just how positive you are and we all are about this band. It's one of the few fandoms where we can agree to disagree. I don't think I've ever seen a fight break out on a forum or on a Twitter thread with regard to Depeche Mode. If somebody happens to like Violator over Songs of Faith and Devotion, the fans don't get mad at each other. They just accept that. We all just love this band, and it's one of the things that I've always loved about the fandom. And honestly, I think it's one of the reasons why Depeche Mode has thrived as long as they have. Because I think there is just a general sense of respect that you have, that I have for this band, and that we have for each other in this common bond that we've all shared throughout our lives and our love of this band. And I'm sure it exists in other music fandoms. I certainly don't see it in movie fandoms, right? Or, series fandoms at all. But I generally couldn't tell you another band where fans are like that. Maybe The Cure, maybe U2. I hope that's the case, just kind of throwing out other bands from that era. But I just know among Depeche Mode fans, there's just you love Depeche Mode, I love Depeche Mode. We all love it for different reasons, and we all accept each other for that. I was listening, as I mentioned, to Some Great Reward this morning, and People Are People came on. One of my least favorite Depeche Mode songs ever. Still love it. Still one of my least favorite. And while I was preparing for the podcast, I just found myself kind of bobbing along to it in a way that I hadn't in a long, long time, and thoroughly enjoying myself. All right, let's get into some listener feedback on this episode. All right, the first comes from Scott, who writes, "Hi, John. Let me start off by saying how much I love listening to your podcast." Thank you, Scott. I appreciate that. "Everything about your insight into Depeche Mode is also how I feel. I've been meaning to write you for a while now. During a backlogged podcast of yours I recently listened to, you mentioned how you lived in Santa Ana, California. I lived in Sheffield, England until I was 12 years old, and then I moved to Huntington Beach, where I lived for the first year of my time in America. That's where I went to the Academy of Radio Broadcasting. After the first year, we moved to Santa Ana, which was quite a culture shock for me, and not in a good way. I went to Los Amigos High School, which is near Miles Square Park. Yep, know it well. And I feel I discovered DM at the right time in my life. When I was living in England, I had never heard of them by name. Looking back, I do remember hearing People Are People, so that song was familiar to me. Bands like Duran Duran, the Thompson Twins, and Madonna were always on the radio, so I really wasn't exposed to DM until the guy that lived next door to me kept driving by playing their albums. I guess it was right around when Violator came out, so I didn't know who the band was, but I realized how much I liked the song, Enjoy the Silence. It seemed different to anything I'd heard before. I was never really into music. I just didn't like anything. I liked instrumentals from soundtracks, which is weird now that I think about it. Not really my 19-year-old son. He listens to soundtracks almost exclusively. DM was the first band I ever loved. I went crazy for them. There was no internet back then, so I didn't know how much stuff was out there on the band, singles, shirts, posters, etc. When I found out, it was a very exciting time for me. Yeah, man, I think, for so many of us, we went through that. I'll never forget going back and discovering Depeche Mode's back catalog after hearing Shake the Disease and going to the store to buy a particular album and sort of mistakenly purchasing Black Celebration, thinking it was a different Depeche Mode release, and then going, oh my gosh, what is this thing I've just found? And I'm so happy, and my life has changed. All right, back to Scott. On the other side of my life, school, pure hell. Granted, all the white kids had either Violator, Metallica, or The Cure shirts, so you knew who was who. I didn't have any friends in school. I was lonely and an outcast. Well, that's how it felt. I didn't talk to anyone because people would make fun of me or beat me up because I was a bit different and had an accent. Kids are cruel, man. That happened a few times to me as well. Part of the high school experience, I guess. So I'm still pretty quiet now, as being an introvert never went away, but I'd like to think I turned out all right. DM played a big part in getting through those rough years. I don't think I'd be here today if it wasn't for this band. I really believe that. Eventually, I bought Violator and just found myself listening to Enjoy the Silence more than anything, and then bought other albums. Thank God for such a large back catalog. I think I started with Construction Time again and worked my way forward. I found I'm not a big guitar fan, and Construction being more metallic laser beam-esque sounding. I loved it. The Landscape is Changing was my favorite. Good on Alan. Right now, I live in Eugene, Oregon. I like it, a lot like England. It rains a lot. I'd love to converse more, including also my love for Star Wars. Oh, see, you know what? There's a synergy there, man. I'm telling you. Thanks, Scott. Thank you, Scott. And I won't say what your email is, but that's not lost on me, by the way. Thank you so much for the email. I really do appreciate it. And Scott, you can now consider yourself a friend of the show. Speaking of friends of the show, Jon Justice, not this Jon Justice, the John John Justice, writes, "Hey buddy, just finished your last DM podcast referring to Barrel of a Gun. I remember buying the CD single while on vacation in Tennessee and hearing it for the very first time. I remember wanting to like it and being scared by what I was hearing. The song grew on me over time, and Ultra was full of great tracks that was able to satisfy my DM thirst. You asked for DM topics at the end, and I know you've gone through the albums, but what if you did a podcast on all the B-sides starting from the beginning? I realize without sound clips that may be challenging, but they left many good tracks off album releases. They also gave the U.S. different tracks than Europe at times, including the entire album People Are People. Hope you are doing well and hoping for an album in 2023. Take care, John." Yeah, for those that don't know, anytime I've done the podcast and put up a version on a YouTube with any Depeche Mode music in it, I immediately get dinged with a cease and desist order. So that's why I've left the music off of the release. I could still do it by just having it on the podcast. They don't ding me for that. So perhaps I'll have to get back to that and just give up the little revenue that I get from YouTube. But that's why you hear... This was actually done by me on GarageBand, which I called Useful. It's my riff on Useless. There was a spell where I went through and actually made an album's worth of instrumental songs, and a lot of them were clearly inspired by Depeche Mode. So, TalkShowNerd@gmail.com, and you can also, of course, go on by mynerdworld.net. But thank you for the listener feedback this week. Want to share with you one particular note as I talk about my latest sci-fi release in my book series. For those that aren't aware, if you don't know about my other podcast or listen to my radio show, I've had 2 open heart surgeries going back to 2009 and 2012. I've had a heart valve replacement and a graft put in for my ascending aorta because I had an aneurysm there. That leaked in 2012, and they had to go back in and fix it. Well, it turns out that I'm headed for open heart surgery number 3 on June 15th. My graft is leaking again, and the cardiovascular surgeons are going to go in and probably replace the graft and give me a permanent fix. I'm not looking forward to having to go through the surgery again, but I am excited to go and get it done. So I would appreciate your thoughts and prayers with that. And there may or may not be a show between now and then, but it's part of the reason why I wanted to get an episode out before the surgery. I know that everything's going to go just fine, but I like to share things on the show. I feel like there's a connection between you that listen and myself, and I appreciate that. So I just wanted to share that with you. And if praying is something you do, I could certainly go and use your prayers for myself and my family. Lastly, if you want to support my nerd world or help me pay for medical bills, not going to do any GoFundMe's or Patreon. However, I do have a science fiction space opera series. And if you want to help support, pick up your preferred copy for you or a friend. And you might be asking yourself, if you're listening for a first time, what does a sci-fi series have to do with Depeche Mode? Well, it has this to do with Depeche Mode. If you love Depeche Mode and you read science fiction, treat yourself or a family member with EMBARK. It's written for adults, but it's great for ages 11 plus. Available in hardcover, paperback, and audiobook. I just released the 7th and final book in the series. It concludes the storyline just thus far. There's a story arc that starts in Book 5, The Rocket Queen, that ends in Battle Planet Book 7, but it really does complete the entire story, starting with EMBARK Book 1. Here's where Depeche Mode comes into play, though. My series is set in the future on Earth, where air and spaceflight culture has replaced car culture. It's inspired in part by Depeche Mode. Life in the so-called space age, the world we live in, and life in general. Depeche Mode plays a role in the underlying themes of the story, and the main character himself, Taft, is a massive Depeche Mode fan at the time in the book. Music of the 80s through 2000s is nostalgic in my story and popular among the characters in EMBARK. So, a fan of DM or the alternative rock of that era, you're going to find a lot of references and specific Depeche Mode references and your favorite bands, both direct and indirect, while telling an exciting sci-fi space opera saga. The story of Book 1 goes as follows. As Earth faces its end, the fight to rule the stars begins. Taft Guardia picked the right day to upgrade his ship when fellow pilot Kate Amaro arrived needing help investigating a cryptic message left behind by her late aerospace engineer father. Unaware that an industrial accident inside Earth's largest supplier of civilian and military spacecraft has set off an apocalyptic chain of events, they make a shocking discovery. As war erupts during the global evacuation, Earth's evacuees stand upon the brink of annihilation. Realizing the significance of what they found, with the help of a ragtag squadron of pilots, Taft and Katha might be humanity's greatest hope for survival among the stars. Don't miss this 2021 Tale Flick Discovery Sci-Fi Award-winning series. If you like your sci-fi space opera epic filled with romance and Depeche Mode and action, then EMBARK is perfect for you. Head on over to Amazon.com. Search for Jon Justice and EMBARK or mynerdworld.net. All right, that wraps up this episode. Again, thank you so much for spending some time with My Nerd World, a Depeche Mode podcast. Look forward to hearing your emails. I hope you'll support my endeavors to become an author. Well, I am an author. I've written 7 books, for crying out loud. The ebooks, by the way, depending on when you're listening to this, are on sale all weekend through Monday. So you can pick up all 7 books in ebook at a discounted price. All right, have yourself a fantastic day, and I hope wherever you are happy, you are healthy, and you are safe. Talk to you later. Bye.
My Nerd World.
And finally, for the most